Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With us today is Chris Rossini as co-host. Chris, welcome to the program.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Very good. Last week you and I talked and we spotted this article because there was a major financial report out about the trade deficit, and it skyrocketed. It went up its largest in 9 years. It was $57 billion. That means we're buying more stuff than we're selling. And this causes a lot of concern. And, if you dissect it out, you might be able to find some things that we ought to be concerned about. But trade deficits per se, should we get excited about this? How excited should we be? And certainly the people in Washington get excited about it. Donald Trump gets excited about it. But I hardly think that a trade war is the answer to this, this statistic that they're quoting, that we're not selling enough stuff. So I think it's a little bit more complex than that. But that's what's in the news, a huge trade deficit, and we have to do something about it. But hopefully we can enlighten ourselves and others exactly what this means.
Yes, and hopefully we can remove their panic from them, because it's an irrational panic, because countries do not trade with one another. Individuals do. Each and every one of us, we make decisions with the resources we have to try to get the best deal that we can, and that applies to everyone that you deal with. So, for example, I have an iPhone sitting next to me here, and I'm not concerned where the iPhone was made, where the glass was made, where each individual components. It could be from all over the world, and I have no interest or ability to chase down where everything came from. And likewise, when I go to the Apple store to buy this phone, I'm not concerned with the salesman, if what religion they are, whether they're Christian or Muslim. And that's the beauty of the marketplace. It sweeps away all these differences, whether they be geographical or political or religious. All we need is the freedom to individually find the best deal from ourselves. And unfortunately, Dr. Paul, government likes to stand in our way.
That's right. I think we get information from trade deficits. There may be a flaw in our policy. Maybe it's difficult for our business people to compete, and that might have to do with regulations and taxes and whatnot. But there is a big shortcoming in the statistic itself, and we've pointed out the GDP has a lot of shortcomings too, because if you build more tanks in an airplane and blow them up, the GDP goes up. So that is not a reliable statistic. And this one is confusing as well. Because what if you have a country that provides a service, and theoretically let's have a Switzerland that provides financial services or financial advice, but no stuff. They don't sell us anything, and yet they buy things from us. So the balance is going to be all out of whack. So this whole idea that you have to balance car for car gets way off track. But we don't keep statistics, between our states. What if we bought? What if the New Yorkers bought more fuel than we buy from New York? We don't buy anything from, let's say theoretically, we don't buy anything from New York. All they sell is business advice, which is a trade. Most of the time when you look at these trade statistics, they're talking about stuff going back and forth. But even the big numbers that might count are more complex than this, and that is the current account, because that involves stuff that you buy, the manufactured good. It counts all the services. It counts all the monetary transfers, like foreign aid, and it also counts the earnings. If we're earning a lot of money from overseas, this is affected. So you have to put that all together for the current account, and lo and behold, the bottom line is the balance of payments. And you know what? It's very hard not to balance the payments, because if not, the whole thing stops. So somebody has to cover these so-called pseudo deficits, and that usually involves borrowing and printing money, and it gets a little bit more complex. But just to get really excited about a trade deficit, I think total foreign debt is important, and I think we suffer from that. But then we get involved in trying to understand what it's like to operate in an economy where a host country has a reserve currency, and that distorts trade as well. So there's a lot of factors in there, but I think the point Chris is making there is that just looking at that statistic and panicking over it and say, hey, we have to do something, and then they treat the symptom, and then it is that understanding and misunderstanding that leads to trade wars, and now we're in the midst of a trade war. One day there's a positive statement made and the stock market can go up 1,000 points, and then the next day our president might say something else. No, we have to be tougher. So there's a lot of psychological impact to the marketplace because they're not dealing with the reality of the trade shortcomings, which I happen to believe are more related to currency problems.
Yes, and those great points about the different government statistics. From a libertarian point of view, the role of government is to protect liberty, not to go around gathering statistics, because that gives them a mentality of central planning, that they're going to compartmentalize and organize human life and use force to do it. And that's just not the way it works. They never succeed. They only impoverish us. So they should get away from collecting all statistics. Statistics should be compiled on a private basis by corporations or private organizations, and because there's no room for central planners. We don't need them. They can't central plan. And we just need, like I mentioned the first time, the freedom to make our own decisions with the resources we have in front of us.
The balance worked out sort of on autopilot under a gold standard. Because let's say one country, you can have deficits, trade deficits more at one time, and they have no significance and they can shift back and forth. But under the gold standard, let's say a country is extravagant. They borrow money and they have the cash and they buy too much and they export their gold because the currency is always in gold. So as their gold supply shrinks, and they're not competing, they have to do something about it. With a smaller amount of gold in the country, guess what happens? Prices go down, and the people work harder. They become more efficient. They try to clean up their act, and then they become more competitive. But that is an autopilot. It isn't something where governments get involved and place on restrictions and regulations and doing all these things. But we've long passed that. We've only had a poor gold standard up until 1971. But since that time, after we went on this the fiat dollar, and we had these massive trade imbalances, because I consider a lot of imbalances there. These numbers that people are concerned about is a reflection of what happened in 1971, because we have a license to print, so we didn't have to clean up our act. We could just print more money, and the people were taking our money, and then we could export our money and buy more goods, and that will cause imbalances. So there are imbalances there. So we can't deny that is going on, but it's not market driven. It isn't driven by the individual purchasing things that they want, that Chris points out. It's driven by this monetary system where one country has the ability to print the gold, so they can keep this going and going. I think one of the important figures is how much have we borrowed? How much have we gotten back from them? People say, this trade imbalance, we're sending our money over there, and they get all the jobs, and the jobs follows, and there's some truth to that. But what do they do with the money? They don't burn it, and they don't put it in a shoebox. It has to come back to us. The dollar eventually come back. Maybe not from China. Let's say China gets more of our cash. They have to, if they didn't buy, something from us, they're going to buy something they want to hold on to. Guess what they buy? They do us this tremendous favor, which is ironically very dangerous for us. They facilitate this whole system because they buy our debt and keep building this bubble bigger and bigger. So if they didn't do that, that takes care of the balance of payments. We print money, we spend it over there, we get the goods and service. There's an imbalance in the trade, and then they come back and say, oh, we love Americans so much, we're going to finance their debt. And then the Americans get mad and say, well, they've taken our jobs too, so we have to punish them. So what people have to wake up to is free markets are much better at this than this government planning. And I think Chris was making this strong point. There's no reason for us to be so dependent on the government to sort these things out. What we should be doing, just like in foreign policy or interventionism here at home, we should just get out of the way and let the invisible hand work. And they think, oh no, that is terrible. That will be unfair. But if you want to talk about unfairness, look at the distribution of wealth in this country as a consequence of this monetary system that we have.
Yes, unfortunately, we have bureaucracy after bureaucracy, and like you pointed out, they just create a Gordian knot, and they just keep making it worse. But with the free market, that's what prices and profit and losses are for. We don't need the government. We all have P&L statements, every corporation, and that tells them everything they need to know. If they're profitable, it means they're efficiently allocating scarce resources and supplying people with something that they want. If there's losses, then that's signaling to you that maybe you should be doing something else. Very simple. It's not political. There's no need for any central planners. P&L statements take care of it, and they show no favoritism. The numbers never lie. But, there's a lot of faith built up into politicians, and we have to somehow weaken that faith.
Right. As we shifted away from even a hint of being monitored by the gold standard, especially after 1971, they wanted a global economy, and there's nothing wrong with a global economy. There was a pretty good global economy in the heydays of the gold standard, the latter part of the 19th century and the 20th century. But then that was lost. But then they say we have to have a global economy. It has to be artificial, and we have to make this dollar work. And then we have to have management, and then there'll be trade imbalances. So they come along with the WTO and NAFTA and think they can manage things. But I think we can get a hint of what it would be like if you had a global economy without a global government. And it was maneuvered and back forth. It was regulated by buying and selling and people picking and choosing on what they want. But we have a national economy, basically. And if you wanted to measure the imbalances between Texas and New York, there's tremendous imbalances. But we don't worry about that. If New York's buying a lot of our oil and we don't buy anything, we don't buy enough services from them to pay for it, well, the money goes somewhere and it has to come back and it circulates. So it isn't one for one. It circulates. So that's easy. They'll say, well, that's the United States. We're one country. But economically speaking, if you had a unit of account you could depend on, such as a commodity currency, you could have the economy work more smoothly than now. But when you have fluctuating fiat currencies, it's a disaster. And that is why, the predictions very early on by Hazlitt in 1945, he says this fluctuating fiat currency and pegging it to the dollar and believing that they're going to keep the dollar attached to gold, he says it's not going to work. They're going to cheat, and they always do. That's why that has to be determined by the marketplace too. But to disrupt the measuring stick of the economy and of value, which should be definable, and of course that means you have to have a unit of account that you can define the value. It would be very helpful. In this country, we define everything by the dollar, and the world in many ways has, but they're getting pretty tired of this because even though everybody does what's in their self-interest, eventually they're going to see that taking dollars for stuff that they send us, they're going to get tired of it. And I think that's what's going on too. We have our side motivated to have a trade war, but of course the other side's motivated to maybe get under the hands of the U.S. government and under the hands of the dollar because they suffer the consequence. You take China, for instance, now they have over $1 trillion of our debt, and they're in the between the rock and the hard place because if they crash the dollar, they lose a lot, but at the same time, if they don't do something, so they're moving away from that. And eventually, though, that will happen. That will have to happen because people will give up on this. So I think that we cannot think about this trade problem without thinking about the currency problem and freedom of choice, individual choices. I've also, following up on what Chris said, is the individual choices of making what they want to buy. I think it's a moral thing too. Why can't people spend their money the way they want? It's their money. And a lot of other times people say, well, we have to protect the jobs of the American people. Well, it never works out that way. They can put some numbers out there and say it will. But let's take, for instance, that China or some other country can provide tennis shoes for the poor people of this country for $20 or $25. That sounds like a pretty good. The same shoe made in America might be $100 for various reasons, maybe even the inflation and wages or whatever. So it's up to $100. So why doesn't the individual who's scraping to survive not be allowed to spend $25 on a pair of shoes and have $75 left over for something else? So this is the whole thing. And if there's a problem with our product, then we have to do something. If we can't compete, somebody else should save us all this money, and we should take our energies and go and produce something else where we can be competitive. The only problem with that right now is there's a little bit of that going on, and we're taking what we have or what we print or what we manage, and we put it into the military-industrial complex. And guess what? We are great at passing out dollars around the world, and we are great. And Trump brags about it, selling military weapons around the world. Well, believe me, that does not raise the standard of living of the average person. Only a few people benefit from that who are in the military industry, and it doesn't solve the problem. And the real way to raise the standard of living of people is to have a sound currency and free choices. And if we're not competitive, then what we need to do is we need to be more competitive, lower taxes, get rid of the regulations, and let these problems sort its way out. But the short-term answer, which is hard, I think, Chris, for us to argue against is, well, if you did that tomorrow, this factory is going to close. And yes, it's artificially too big anyway. And to do that, it's the same way as cutting off the spigot of monetary inflation. There will be some people that are going to suffer if you quit spending this money. But it might be several months to clean up the situation. So it is a tough situation. This is why, unfortunately, Chris, I think we're going to see bad times ahead. But I'm also optimistic that more people will be awakened to think about how liberty solves the problem, how free markets and free choices can be a benefit to everybody.
Yes, and I'll finish by asking our viewers and listeners to the podcast to help awaken others. If you like what you hear today, and it should be different than what you find anywhere else, please share it with others, because we're living in a sea of central planners, and they're clueless, and they don't have the superpowers that they think that they have, but people believe them. So please help us to spread these ideas of free markets, individual liberty. Thanks.
And I think in my close, I want to point out that so often when there's a problem, the political pressure means that the Congress and others have to respond for political reasons. And people say, well, that's good. That's what they're supposed to respond. But what they want you to do might not be based on sound economic policy. And that is where the big problem is. So it is an economic understanding that is important. And it's very difficult, to say to the drug addict, you have to get off there and you're going to have some bad symptoms. Or somebody comes in and they have a very, very serious disease that needs a major operation, but it will save your life, but you have 6 months of recovery. Oh, that's a different story. Yes, you will go through it. But the whole thing is this problem is created artificially. It's not created by too much freedom. Believe me, that is not our problem. We have too few freedoms and liberty. We don't have enough liberty, but we need to do that because the most prosperous countries in the world have been the freest country. And we have represented that viewpoint for many, many years. But our prosperity is fake now. It is not as sound as people think. The stock market all of a sudden is is less valuable this week than it was last week. And although the statistics come out and say everything is rosy, believe me, the foundation has eroded, and it looks like it could topple any time. And that has to do with the understanding of what the role of government ought to be. And the role of government should be very precise. It should be the protection of liberty and property and the protection of people's individual rights. That would go a long way to solve a lot of problems. Can't solve all the problems, but believe me, when you turn it over to the bureaucrats and the people who run things, the special interests move in. As soon as you deliver power to the federal government or any government, the special interests move in and they take control, and that's where the problems start. So our view is that more liberty is what is needed, not more government regulation, and a lot less treating symptoms rather than looking to the basic cause of our problems that we have today. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.